Can everyone hear me? Good. Welcome to the last day of TechEd. Welcome to Certificate Enrollment Across Boundaries. My name is Rashmi Jha. Most of you saw me in the previous presentation John Morello did. I and Sunil combined will be doing Certificate Enrollment Across Boundaries. We will be covering Certificate Enrollment Policy Web Service and Certificate Enrollment Web Service. From here on, for brevity's sake, I will use CEP and CES for these two services. After that, we will look into the deployment scenarios. Where would you want to deploy these services and designing points and few of the installation requirements you would like to keep in your mind rather than go and read a white paper before making the decision. We will go over that. And then we will change the topic entirely to NDES, that is Network Device Enrollment Service. I saw in the previous presentation there was quite interest in that topic also. So let's begin with, this prereq. I just wanted to mention that while doing this presentation, I made a fair assumption that my audience might be knowing something about PKI and will be a bit aware of Active Directory certificate services. Let's start with the PKI challenges in enterprises. I'm again and again going back and referring to the previous presentation as it was interesting for me. I was listening for the first time from the customer point of view, from the customer saying how they have these employees who go and never come back for a year. So how will you enroll certificates for these kind of employees? Employees who are never in the corporate domain. They have machines which the administrator can never manage, but they will still use PKI-based applications. So how would you get certificates enrolled on these kind of machines? Then there was a couple of questions about PKI complexity where you have n number of CAs. Though the services I'm going to talk about doesn't solve that problem, still you could utilize it there also. So I'm going to just briefly mention about CEP and CES in those scenarios. Let's first see how the flows goes with certificate enrollment where you don't have CEP and CES. It's the DCOM world. At times it might think that I'm getting into nitty-gritty details or my colleague is getting into nitty-gritty details, but these details at times help you to troubleshoot problems. So let's look at this flow. The client here will be in a domain joined scenario. It's a domain joined machine. It will query Active Directory on LDAP and get the information. Then with this information, the client will create a certificate request and make a RPC DCOM connection to certificate authority. It will use the old ISET request submit DCOM interface to submit the request to certificate authority based on the information it got from Active Directory. Now certificate authority processes the request and sends it back to the client workstation, again on RPC DCOM. So this whole scenario you see is based on DCOM, heavily relying on DCOM and Kerberos authentication. So it does break those scenarios where you have employees who do not have, who are not in your domain, who will be working over the internet. So Microsoft did heard the feedback, and in Windows 2008 R2 introduced two services, CEP and CES. These two services are based on new enrollment protocols. These protocols are open document. That means like anyone can pick up those documents and write their own CEP and CES client. Basically, these two services uses HTTPS. So the client will always talk to these services through HTTPS endpoint. They won't ever talk directly to the Active Directory or certificate authority. Now you might be getting a bit confused. Because if you are aware of CA web enrollment pages, even that takes the request over HTTPS. So what's different between CA web enrollment pages and the CEP service? Well, these two technologies are obviously complementary. They don't substitute each other. CA web enrollment pages, you're going to use where you really need to construct a specific request. So web enrollment pages provide you an interactive way of creating the request. Whereas CEP and CES, what it solves the problem is to have an automatic enrollment and renewal across boundaries, where you might have your machine in the same domain, but it's on the network boundary. You have DMZ, and these machines could not connect to go through the firewall. In those scenarios, also you can use CEP and CES. The administrator can go in, configure the right settings in the group policy, or through some mechanism, put it in the local policy, provision it on the user's laptop, and then whenever the user is on internet, they can enroll for certificates automatically. So one is interactive, and the other one is automatically where there is no interaction needed, and that's the whole point. Let's look at the flow here and understand better how certificate enrollment works with CEP and CES. Now here in the picture, I have CEP and CES on two different boxes. It's not a hardcore requirement. This is just for illustration purposes. I have put these two services on a different box. They could be on the same box. The client workstation here can be in a domain joint scenario or on a non-domain joint scenario. But the whole point I want to stress on this slide is that the client can only pass through HTTPS traffic. It cannot make any other call to CEP and CES. So as in the old world, the client will request for policies or the certificate templates, but it will be on HTTPS. CEP in turn will make the LDAP query to Active Directory. Active Directory will return the information back to the CEP service, and CEP service in turn will give those policies to the client. Now, client workstation will take that information and decide which certificate templates it needs to enroll from, and this time along the policies, enrollment list URIs might have come in which it had the CES URIs which are available for enrollment. So it will pick up the CES enrollment URIs from which it can enroll and submit the certificate request to CES, again using HTTPS. CES, what it does now is that it takes the certificate request, it impersonates the security context of the user, and delegates the call to certificate authority. Again, it invokes the same old iSet request TCOM interface to submit the request to certificate authority. Certificate authority sends back the certificate after processing it, and CES sends it back to client workstation. So this is the general flow for you to give a basic idea how a CES and CEP scenario would work. Now, where would you want to deploy CES and CEP? Let's look at single forest. Actually, this is a scenario which is really CES and, it's not that CES and CEP enables it, but still you can deploy CES and CEP and take the advantage of it that your clients will always talk to this to HTTPS endpoint, and you can have CES and CEP in a DMZ so that the client will never be able to talk to the AD or to the certificate authority directly. So you are clamping down your Active Directory and certificate authority. So it's a simple deployment scenario, but still it gives benefit from the view of CES and CEP. Forest consolidation. Again, it's not something CES and CEP enables, because in Windows 2008 R2, we did introduce DCOM cross-forest enrollment. So CES and CEP is similar to that, but the benefits which I talked about in single forest, same is applicable even in forest consolidation, that now you just provide 2 HTTPS endpoint rather than making a DCOM connection. Then comes the extranet scenario. The extranet scenario is actually the scenario which is being enabled with CEP and CES. It reminds me of our customer. They wanted to implement direct access. It is one of the major consulting firm, and then 90% of the employees are always at the consultant base, at the customer base. So how it would have been really nice for them to have direct access on their employees' laptop. So the moment they open their laptop, they're connected to internet, they're connected to intranet. Now direct access uses certificates. So how they would get certificates if in the first place when they are not connected? So how it was done is, in the bootstrapping process, the configuration was set in the local policy that whenever they connect to internet, the first enrollment happen for the certificate over HTTPS. So in this manner, or another scenarios where you have machines over the network boundary and you want to make enrollment, where you don't have employees working from long distance. There are various scenarios. They can just enroll using HTTPS. They have connection to internet, but not to the company intranet. So till now, we have been focusing on enrollment. So let's talk about renewal, because it slightly changes when we are doing renewal. As I talked earlier, CES, when it receives the certificate request, it delegates the call to CA. It impersonates the security context of the user and makes the call on behalf of the user. So for some scenarios, for internet scenarios, that would not be recommended or accepted by some customers, because internet actually increases the risk of attacks. So for renewal scenario, what CES does is enables another renewal only mode, where when you're installing CES, you would say install it only for renewal mode. So in that scenario, when an enrollment request comes in, actually enrollment request is denied, sorry. When a renewal request comes in, what CES does, CES uses its own credentials to forward it to the CA, certificate authority. Certificate authority, in turn, does not look at the user credentials, I mean, in the sense of processing the certificate. It looks at the original request of the certificate. Who was the original requester of the certificate? And based on the requester's permission of the original certificate, it validates the renewal cert request and then issues the certificate. So there is a slight difference between how enrollment happens and how renewal request. Because it's a renewal request, you can rely that the first original certificate was received from some internal mechanism and was verified, and you trust that original certificate, and based on that, you renew the certificate. Now, certain things you would keep in mind when you are ready to deploy CES and CEP. How would you design the infrastructure? So we will go over these points: firewall configuration, delegation, service accounts, and selecting authentication methods. Again, CEP and CES on a different box. I just want to be clear that we are not saying have different boxes for each service. So again, CEP and CES are on a different box just for illustration purposes. Now, the user here or the end entity, that can be a computer or a user, makes a HTTPS call to CES and CEP. So the only port it can access through or you can enable is TCP 443. And between CEP and Active Directory, you can have firewall configured only for LDAP TCP 389.636. And between CES and Certificate Authority, you could have DCOM, but as we know, DCOM basically used random ports. So maybe you can configure DCOM to use a short range of ports and then configure your firewall around it. So we can see how the end entity is basically never will be able to contact to your AD. Now, yes?
Obviously, those two machines in the DMZ do not need to be member machines.
They need to
be a domain member of machine. Yes, CES and CEP needs to be a domain, on the domain, in the same domain as the CA. We will come to that in the installation requirements also.
Well, those ports are not sufficient for domain participation.
Correct.
Yeah.
Have an IPsec connection if you have a backend file.
Yeah.
Use IPsec to call the traffic from CES.
What, through those other ports?
No, you just use normal IPsec communication with that, just like flush those actual everything would go over an IPsec.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was a picture question with regard to picture. That's why I took the question. But I would highly encourage you to keep your questions for the last so we can answer as a team and attack it all at once. Moving on to the next slide, delegation. So I talked about how in the full enrollment request, CES delegates the call to CA. So we need to enable delegation on CES, specifically on CES in certain scenarios where the CA and the CES is not on the same computer. CES requires full enrollment. During renewal, it actually does not delegate, so that's why you wouldn't need to enable delegation. Then the authentication type is Kerberos or certificate authentication. So all these three requirements put together, only then you need to enable delegation on CES account. So CES can run as application pool identity or it can run as a domain user account. So while installing CES, there is an option as to which account would you like to install. And this domain user account needs to be member of IIS users group. And this account needs to have request certificate permissions on the CA. Now CEP by default gets installed as application pool identity, but you can go to IIS Manager Snap-in and change it to run as a domain user account too. Managed service accounts are, again, you would need to install CES and CEP as application pool identity, and then in IIS Manager Snap-in, you would need to configure it to use managed service accounts. Authentication methods. So the client which is connecting to CES and CEP would need to authenticate itself. It could authenticate via three authentication methods. First one is Windows integrated authentication. It's basically you're using Kerberos. So when would you want to use Kerberos? Because again, it leads to the same old DCOM world. But as I mentioned the scenarios of single forest consolidation, in those scenarios, it will be preferable to use Kerberos so that the user will have a seamless experience. He won't be prompted for a username password, for example. The enrollment will be automatically, and the renewal will also happen automatically. Then client certificate authentication. It is considered to be more secure than the username password, as we all know. password generally tends to be more vulnerable to attacks. Username password itself has the advantage of being a simple form of authentication. So you might consider it in those scenarios. But at the same time, I forgot to mention, in client certificate authentication method, suppose you have installed a CES which has client certificate authentication, and now you're enrolling for your first certificate. Which certificate would you present? Because you don't have a certificate. So you would need to get that first particular certificate from some other manner. It would be DCOM, enrollment, or it could be username password. You have another CES deployed with username password authentication. So client certificate authentication has this challenge that for the first time, from where would you get the certificate? So you would need some other mechanism for it. And username password has that advantage over client certificate authentication, that you don't need to provision the machine or the user with a certificate already. Anonymous authentication is not supported. Now, let's look at quickly at the minimum installation requirements you would need to keep in mind when deploying CES and CEP. So it needs to be Windows Server 2008 R2. It needs to be domain joined machine. It can work only with enterprise CA. And you can have the DC to be Windows 2008, but the schema needs to be updated to 2008 R2. And clients needs to be Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 R2 to enroll from them. It's HTTPS based, so obviously you need a SSL certificate to get CES and CEP working. Enterprise admin privileges are required for installation. So these are the few installation requirements which you can look up at the slide. But I would like to take a minute and talk about the inbuilt client's fault tolerance and load balancing mechanism. So I don't have a slide for that, but I thought it will be valuable information. So basically, when this client sends the request to CEP or to CES, to CEP for retrieving the policy, to CES for getting the certificate, in both the scenarios, what happens is that for some reason that particular HTTPS endpoint failed, but you have multiple CEP published, multiple CEP URIs published. Then the client would go to the next one. So in that manner, it will iterate through all the URIs published. So it has that inbuilt mechanism. And now you take this URIs and you put it behind an NLB. It won't work because the client will go to the NLB, one URI. It didn't work. It will fail and come back. So in that manner, we are really not utilizing the inbuilt technology the client provides us. So it's recommended that for CES and CEP to have published different URIs and take advantage of only those technologies which has the network as well as application layer knowledge. So that was a short information on inbuilt CES and CEP fault tolerance. Now I will hand it over to my colleague, Sunil Kondapalli. He is the senior developer on this product itself. So we are glad to have him.
Thanks, Rashmi. Good morning, everyone. I recognize many of the faces here because we were in the PKI booth for certificate services and some of we talked. So as I woke up today morning, the first thing I did is open the curtains for my windows. And the first thing I noticed is that there is sunshine here. So I don't know how many people are from Seattle and Redmond area, but we do notice sunshine. I don't know where John is from. John, you are from Luz? So he does not have this issue. And incidentally, I have met one of the people here whose name is Sunshine, by the way. And I said to her, you should come to Seattle. So I'm Sunil. I'm the senior dev on Active Directory Certificate Services team. I have been with the team for about, I'll break at June 12th, I'll be 5 years exactly. And it has been great working on the team. So Rashmi gave an excellent introduction of some of the challenges you might be facing in the PKI space. And then what we have done in R2, what we have built in R2 to address some of those issues. And now I'm going to take you through a demonstration of how to install CEP and CES, and we'll work on a simple scenario. So I have been debating between these two scenarios. One of them is a vendor comes to your company and they want a wireless auth certificate. And how do they get it in today's world? In pre-Windows 7 world, probably what they have had to do is probably they have to go to your administrator's office somewhere in your company, give the credentials, get a certificate installed on their box, and then they go ahead and work. Because their machine might be non-domain joined, but they have a valid Exchange or AD account, but their machine is non-domain joined. So what should they do to get a cert? They go to the administrator's office, walk physically to the administrator's office, get the credentials and other things, install the wireless cert, and they go back. What happens after 6 months or 1 year when it comes for renewal? They have to follow a similar process. They have to walk back to the administrator's office and do it. Now, multiply that with hundreds and thousands of vendors your company may be having. With CEP and CES, you have just eliminated that huge manual portion of your overhead there. So we'll see. So that's one of the scenarios I was thinking of presenting, and maybe I'll go with that one. So there is the other scenario where a web server, non-domain joined web server machine sits there, and then it has its SSL certificate, and it is happily servicing its clients. On a Sunday night, you would receive a call. The web server went down because it is not able to renew its certificate. So that means typically what customers do is they develop custom solutions or to keep track of these certificates. When are they going to expire? And they send emails to people, and that is what I heard. So I don't have time to demonstrate that scenario. So we'll stick to the vendor scenario. So having said that, okay, so I need to switch to C. There. So this is the topology I have. This is not a typical representation of your production deployments. The hardware on this box is 4 GB RAM, and I can accommodate only 3 VMs. So I'm running the DC and the CA on one machine, which is probably not what you want to do. CES and CEP also are running on the same machine, and there are some challenges there. I'll address those issues particularly. And then we have non-domain joined client, which we can assume to be the machine of the vendor. And let's give her a name, let's call her Alice. So let's start first with installation of CES and CEP. So this is the familiar. How many of you are developers here? Just, I'm curious. All right, okay. So, okay, the reason I asked is that I wanted to know how much detail I should go into. So we start with clicking on Active Directory Certificate Services. Next. By default, certification authority is checked, you uncheck it. And this is our enrollment service, and this is our policy service. Now, just to recap what Rashmi talked about, a policy service abstracts AD. A CES abstracts the CA, certificate authority. It's like a proxy to the CA, so that the clients don't have to go directly to the DC AD anymore for fetching the templates. With CS are servicing these templates. What are the voids? So you can clamp down the traffic on the DC. So they go to the CEP. CEP abstracts AD, and it services the clients. CES, on the other hand, is the proxy of the CA. They don't have to directly connect. You don't need a direct connection to the CA anymore. The clients don't need a direct connection to the CA anymore. That means your CA is much more secure. Next. So here, the enrollment web service, as I talked, is a proxy to the CA, so we need to select a CA. I already have an enterprise CA installed. And I'm not checking this box here because that is for renewal-only mode. So what is that mode? In the normal mode, the CES needs to impersonate the user. So if Alice comes to CES, CES does some magic there, and CA sees the request as coming from Alice. So that is called impersonation. Many admins don't like exposing these impersonated boxes in the DMZ or the edge on the boundaries. So what they typically do is, they do the initial enrollment somewhere in the CorpNet, issue the certificate, and then they deploy the renewal-only mode in the DMZ. The renewal-only mode does not need to impersonate the user. So It is much more secure because in the DMZ, you are kind of exposing your traffic to the outside world. So that is the renewal-only mode, which we are not going to demonstrate now. So we're going. Now, the Windows which one would you select? Windows integrated auth? In this specific scenario, Alice machine is not domain joined. So the DCOM and RPC, you cannot select the Kerberos authentication. Can you select client certificate authentication? Well, no, because what does client certificate authentication mean? If you know what certificates are, certificate is nothing but a proof that ties subject me to the key pair there. So if I present the certificate to anybody, it's like, oh, it's me, almost like me. So that means the certificate needs to be there, already there with you to be able to prove that it is who you are. But now in this Alice case, she does not have a certificate yet. So we are targeting the initial enrollment. And so this is the only one that you can select for our specific case here. And then the CES and CEP can run under service accounts, which is recommended. So there is a limitation because I have the limited hardware here. I am kind of going with application pool identity, where both CES and CEP would be running under the same application pool identity, and it would run. Even I can select a domain user. There is nothing wrong with that, but there are some advanced configuration settings that you need to do on the CEP side of the things to do the thing. Because CEP by default is supposed to run as application pool identity. Now, how many of you know what application pool identity is? I'm surprised. That's good, because this is introduced in R2. Earlier, you might be knowing the network service. Network service is a low privilege service, and which runs in the services run in the context of network service. The application pool identity is introduced in R2. What it does is it isolates the worker process to be much more in a narrower frame, so that they cannot interact with the other things. So it is much more secure. So that is probably another reason why you should probably get upgraded to R2. So let's move on to the application pool identity. And now this is all you need to do. I have already configured an SSL certificate on IIS. The SSL certificate is already configured in IIS. That is why you are not seeing it. Otherwise, you would get an option to select that also. So here is where you can manually configure the SSL certificate if you want to. So if you right-click, edit bindings. So as you see, it is already there. If it is not there, the UI the server manager would have presented an option saying, hey, select this certificate for SSL certificate. So now we are installing. It might take a couple of minutes. So there is this one guy who was doing some magic in the exhibition hall yesterday. I don't know how many of you have seen that. So he asks you to think about a person and then write their name on the piece of paper, and then boom, you don't show it to anybody. There are no cameras hanging up there, but he's kind of telling you what you have written. And I tried to figure that out, but I could not. All right. So that finishes the installation for CEP and CES. So there is one setting that I want to show you. If you want to run CEP as service account, this may not seem like that important, but if you are installing on the same box and you want to run CES as a domain account, there will be some SPN conflict, and so your clients won't be able to see. That is the reason why I'm pointing this. So just keep that in mind. When you are going to really install and configure things, keep this in mind. You can read our white paper where steps are thoroughly documented. So I won't go in too deeply here. So now that the CEP and CES are installed, let's configure some of the things. So you go to default website. So that is the URL for CEP, which is the policy service, abstracts AD. This is the URL for CES. So let's go to application settings. Here, you can configure a friendly name. So this is what your vendor will see when she retrieves the templates and policies. So let's give a name, Quantiso Corporate Policy. That's all you need to do. And this URL, you can probably, so okay, now let's switch gears here and go to the Alice machine. So this is how Alice sees the world. Seems slow. So this is Alice machine. Now she wants to get a certificate. You go to personal store, do a so there are a couple of ways in which you can configure the policy URL. She can configure the policy URL. You can go to manage enrollment policies, and it's already there. Let me remove it. So you can configure it that way. There you can add it, or you can directly go ahead and request a new certificate. If it is there, okay, it's not there, but I mean, I was just going through the demo once, so I think those are left out there. So the URL, now, how does Alice get this URL? So one way is to, for the enterprise, is to do through custom web pages, where as soon as she goes to a browser, a custom web page displays that, oh, here is your CEP URL where you can retrieve your policies and certificates. That's one of the ways. Here I'm just copying the string. So add new. And that is the URL of CEP. And then she can give her username and password. Now, as I said, Alice has an account, console.com, but her machine is non-domain joined. Might take, okay, because it is the first time, so what happens is that CEP is not launched until now. Only when the first request goes to the process, then the IS launches it. But once it launches, it would be pretty fast. The first time you saw that little bit of delay. So you say add and click next. So there are two certificates. So none of them is a wireless auth certificate that I have configured. The reason is that I didn't configure the CA to issue a wireless auth cert. That is why you're not seeing it. So this is the wireless auth template that we have, which has an extension of EKU as the client cert authentication. So let's bring up the CA console. And this is what you can do. New certificate template to issue. And wireless authentication certificate. So now the CA is able to issue that certificate, certificate for wireless auth template. Then that template also can be constrained only for a vendor group, for example. That way, vendors will only see that they can request certificates for that particular template. Now, because I have reissued it afterwards, so I need to do a little bit of. So why am I doing that? Once CEP by default caches all the templates and other things within its process memory. So the caching time by default is about 30 minutes, and templates is not something you would go ahead and add and delete in every minute or something. It's a very top level decision that needs to be taken, and which probably takes days and days. So within 30 minutes, it would refresh its template. But that configuration setting also can be changed. We can set it to 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 milliseconds, it does not matter. So for now, let's go ahead and retrieve the passwords again. So basically what would happen is that the user would see a wireless auth search here. So because we have, so the policy URL gets cached in a registry setting. You can even directly go to and delete it here. So what I'm doing there is I have deleted it so that I can redo my CEP and it will fetch the templates. So cert manager.msc, what time is it? So we'll do that one more time. Request new certificate, next, add new, this one. Validate, and then again Alice password, console.dom Alice. So that is what the user will see. That is what we configured, the console corporate policy. If you don't see, give a friendly name. Now that is the wireless auth cert. Here I would like to show just one thing. Who is the certification authority? You see that there is a CES URL there. That means the CEP has done a lot of work underneath. It figured out who came in. It figured out that Alice came in. Alice has permissions on all these policies. These policies are serviced by these particular enrollment servers, and it has filtered all those things depending upon the ACLs and other things, and it has just returned that one CES URL. And now you click OK, and click Enroll. And now why is it asking it again? Because it didn't remember my credentials, and also because it is going to the CES now. Earlier it got the templates from CEP, and now it is going to the CA. So we are entering the password again, console.dom Alice. Unless my password is wrong there, should get it. There, there's the wrong password. things have a way of not working in demos. There. So we got the cert. You can look into the cert. So details. So that's the wireless art cert. So it is issued to Alice. So how do I really know that this certificate came from CEP and CES and not through your DCOM RPC? People may not like the cert util here, but that's one of the very versatile tools that we have. Store user, dash user, I think it's dash user. There. So if you look at there is a property that we have introduced, so which is called cert CEP prop ID, and you see that so basically that's the property. And I trust this output, and if you trust me, basically you can trust that output. So we have written that tool. So the certificate that you really got it from this. So now what have we done so far? Alice non-domain joint machine has an AD or Exchange account. She's able to get her own certificate without going to administrator's office. That's the thing. Multiply that with 1,000 vendors, you have eliminated a huge overhead for your company. How about renewal story? If you introduce client certificate authentication, again, similar installation in the DMZ, for example, when it's time to renew this certificate, a UI will pop up for Alice, which says, hey, time to renew your certificate. Click OK. OK, boom. It will go ahead and renew the certificate for Alice. Again, you have eliminated a huge portion there. So that concludes the demonstration for CEP and CES. If you have any questions, we'll take it at the end. And I'll hand it over back to Rashmi for network device enrollment service.
Thank you, Sunil. Let's totally change the topic now. Let's move on to network device enrollment service. Again, it's an enrollment service. But this enrollment services is for devices. For example, you see nowadays iPad, Android phone. I mean, the number of consumer devices in the market is just increasing. And all these consumer devices necessarily won't have the Windows client on it, the complex technology to get the auto-enrolled cert and the auto-renewed certificate. So CEP is a protocol which lets these devices, a very lightweight protocol, to enroll for certificates on such devices. What is CEP? CEP is Simple Certificate Enrollment Protocol. And Network Device Enrollment Service is the Microsoft implementation of it. So CEP defines the communication between the device and the service so that in the end of it, there is a private key on the device and its associated certificate on the device so that it can use the certificate for various purposes, like for use for PKI applications. It could even authenticate itself on the network. Let's move on to, these are the things we will go over today for NDES. That is, we will look at the enrollment flow and few of the NDES components and talk about relatively new features, then skim through entities involved with NDES. Now, NDES enrollment. So how it starts? First, the device itself, which could be anything, from iPad to a slot machine in Las Vegas. So what it would need to do is basically create a public-private key pair, RSA, for cryptographic operations. Now, it has to be enabled for either for encryption and decryption or for signature verification, or it could be the case where it is enabled for both kind of cryptographic operations. Now, the device administrator goes to NDES and requests for the password. Basically, this password, then the device is going to authenticate itself to the NDES. It will tell, I am the same person to whom you had given the password. So the requesting of the password is through HTTP. So there is basically, when you install NDES, you have virtual directories installed, and this is a CEP extension, and it installs two virtual directories, that is MSCP and MSCP admin. MSCP admin is the website where the device administrator will go to fetch the password. It is recommended to have it on SSL so that the password, when it's given to the device administrator, is not transferred over the wire in clear text, rather it is encrypted. So that's why we would highly recommend to use SSL here. Now, when the device administrator requests the password, what NDIS does it checks for the permission for this device administrator, whether this device administrator has the enroll permissions on the templates or not. So NDIS has this registry settings, that is encryption template, signature template, general purpose template. So these registry settings will have the templates in it, and it will check the enroll permission on the administrator. Again, it might seem too much of information, but if something doesn't work, these information might help you to troubleshoot the problem. So device administrator needs to have enroll permission on all these templates. So it could be the same template mentioned in all these three registry settings or different one. If the scenario is with the standalone CA and not an enterprise CA, so there's no question about templates, in that scenario, the device administrator would need to be a member of CA administrator group. Now, the administrator takes the password and sets it on the device, and it establishes the trust point with the PKI in question. After that, the device creates the certificate request, or the device administrator sits on the device and creates the certificate request and forwards it to NDIS. NDIS then constructs the certificate request and forwards it to the CA. Now, while constructing the request, NDIS looks at what it has received from the device in the key usage extension. Based on that key usage extension, it uses the template for which it needs to enroll for. So the key usage extension could be encryption, decryption, or signature verification. And if nothing is mentioned, then NDIS just uses the template mentioned under general purpose template registry setting. And suppose you don't have anything mentioned in all these templates in the registry, there's no key usage extension, then NDIS would use IPsec offline template to issue the certificate, to create the certificate based on that template. It's hard-coded in NDIS. Now, when CA, again, NDIS makes a call to CA using the same iCert request DCOM interface. CA processes the request and gives back the certificate to NDIS, which in turn returns back to the device. But if it's the standalone scenario, where the standalone CA is always set to pending by default, or you might have your enterprise CA set to pending. So in that case, there won't be a certificate returned to the device. So the device will then need to make a specific request to retrieve the certificate, which might be issued in some point later. So when it retrieves, it tries to make a call for retrieval, and the certificate has been issued by CA, then NDIS procures the certificate and forwards it to the device. So, yeah. Then moving on to NDIS components. So I already talked about there are two virtual directories, MSCP and MSCP admin. MSCP is actually where all the communication happens between the device and the service. So in the previous slide, when we were talking about the administrator setting up the trust point with the CA, it was basically making a get CA cert operation. Again, that was sent to the first virtual directory, MSCP. even to retrieve the cert, even to enroll for the certificate. So it's the first URI where the device needs to send its request. The second URI is always used in the case of getting the password. So password. So password here is basically a mechanism which enables the device to say or to authenticate itself to NDES to say, I'm the same person. You have already checked the permission that I can enroll for these certificate templates. This password which device administrator gets it, is only valid for 60 minutes by default. And at a time, it can be used for 2 certificate requests, or it might be able to be used only for 1 certificate request. So if you have your key usage extension for digital signature and encryption decryption, so basically in the same certificate, then you can use it only for 1 certificate request. And if you are individually asking certificates, 1 for encryption and 1 for signature, then you can have 2 certificate requests. So, and this password is 8 Unicode characters. All this information I'm giving is basically, this is the default setting, and it is for security purposes, and you can modify them in the registry to fit your security needs accordingly. Going over to service certificates. So I missed to mention, when NDES created the certificate request in the previous slide, it basically encrypted the challenge, encrypted the password with its enrollment agent, with its encryption certificate. It encrypted the password, and it signed the request with its signature certificate. So these are the 2 certificates which NDES gets it when it is installed. So when you are installing NDES, NDES goes and sets permission for itself on the certificate templates, and then sets the CA to issue those templates. And these templates are hard-coded in NDES that use these templates to set the permission and enroll for certificates and get me those 2 certificates, which NDES is going to use every time for these operation of signing the of encrypting the password and signing the request. Moving on to relatively new features. So these are 2 features which are available actually in Windows 2008 and Windows 2008 R2 after the updates I have mentioned on the slide. So actually we have this customer. He has 10,000s of slot machines in Las Vegas, and he wanted this slot machine to participate in the PKI transactions and authenticate itself. So he wanted security to be in place, and he used certificates for the slot machine to authenticate itself on the network. So as I was talking about the password earlier, it was really not feasible for them to take the password and put it in all the 10,000 machines, and only that for 1 cryptographic operation, or at the most 2, depending on how they did it. So it was not feasible for them. So they came to us. So we implemented use single password mode, where they could get the password. So it's basically a registry setting which you can change in NDES, and you can change the default mode to use single password mode. So what will happen is that now you use that password for multiple cryptographic operations. You don't have to keep requesting password and going back to the device and changing the password. And you can use the same password on multiple slot machines. So they could take the same password and put it on all their 10,000 slot machines. So they were kind of hands-off from the perspective of enrollment. They could enroll for any number of certificates on any number of machines. So then moving on to renewal. So still, the renewal problem was not solved. Now again, for renewal, previous to this, actually we used to do a new enrollment rather than renewal. So we implemented renewal, where now we use like CES we were talking about, we use the original certificate to sign the request. So basically, you present your original certificates. Hey, I have received a certificate already. Based on that, issue me or renew my this certificate. So that's the renewal. So now, if you have NDES implemented and you have renewal, it will just go and use the original certificate to renew. So administrator really doesn't have to do anything. It doesn't need a password for it. So with this two feature, basically that company was now hands off. Once the password is set, enrollment is fixed, auto renewal can go on, and administrator is free. To go on to entities involved. Actually, yeah, it's just for reference sake, NDES administrator is the person who really goes and install the administrator, install NDES. And then NDES service account, again, can be run as application pool identity, or it could be run as a domain user account. Then device administrator is the person who basically maintains the device, and he needs to get the password from NDES, and he needs to have the enroll permission on specific certificate templates, which we talked about earlier. So you can skim through this. Now I will hand it over back to Sunil to show a demo on NDES.
Right, thanks, Rashmi. We are back to NDES, A or C? C. All right. Again, recapping the big picture, what is network device enrollment service? So you have all these devices, routers, ATM machines, casino machines, and nowadays mobile devices sitting out there which are not joined. Am I talking too fast? Okay, good. Which are not joined to the domain. That means they don't have an identity in the AD. If a device comes in, the enterprise cannot recognize who it is. So how do we get certificates to these devices then? Alice there has an account. Here, the router does not have an account. So that means CA is internal to the corp, device is outside, and it has no identity in the AD. CA cannot recognize that. So somebody needs to sit in between and verify both ways. Somebody needs to say, hey, this device is trusted by me, and CA, you trust me, so you should be able to issue the certificate to that device. It's the same thing I was talking about earlier. So that is what NDES, Network Device Enrollment Service, does. And it implements the simple certificate enrollment protocol, which is co-authored by Cisco and Microsoft. So how do we trust the device? So NDES is sitting here in between. It wants to trust the device. How does it trust it? So the administrator logs into this box, issues a password, and somehow secretly transfers this password onto the device. Then the device then submits a request to NDES. So NDES should be able to look into itself, into its memory or something, and say, yes, I issued this password to that person, and so it is a valid request coming in. Oh, okay. Then it submits the request to the CA. CA sees the request as coming from this network device enrollment service. And there is something, a magic, which tells the CA that you should trust me. So basically what happens is that NDES requests an enrollment agent certificate from the CA, and it signs the request, re-signs the request with that certificate. Because the CA issued that certificate, CA can crack open the request and say, oh, this is signed by a certificate issued by me for the enrollment agent template, so I can trust this, whoever is submitted it. And basically that's how the trust happens. Password trust, enrollment agent trust. So the CA finally issues the certificate to the device. So now we'll go ahead and install NDES. Again, you may not want to install it on the same machine. So close. So this is a role service. So if you have noticed it, earlier I pressed add roles. Now I am clicking on add role services. The reason is when there is none of the ADCS certificate role services installed, all the 6 of them, you will have to click it as a role. Otherwise, you can just go ahead and click role services. So we say network device enrollment service. Next. Again, this is the recommended, the user account, and the application pool identity. We are using it because of other reasons here, because of the practical limitations here. Oh, one interesting point I forgot to mention is, I think it is on her slide, managed service accounts. How many of you know managed service accounts? Okay, well, not bad. There is a reason, in CES and CEP especially, there is a reason why you may want to consider using managed service accounts. So if you install the services with a domain account, that domain has policies about password expiry and resets and all those things. So you would find yourself someday, everything is working fine and everything goes down because the password has expired. You have to keep track of these things. So to alleviate that, we have introduced managed service accounts in R2, and I'm not sure about 2008 though, R2 at least. So managed service accounts, you don't have to reset the password at any point of time. It automatically resets itself. That means there is uninterrupted service going to always happen. So you should consider using it. So what's the downside of the managed service accounts? Managed service accounts is per machine. Although it is a domain entity, it's still per machine. That means you cannot share that managed service account between different CEPs and CES on different boxes. You will have issues there. But you can create managed service account for each of these machines, and they will automatically do the password resets. So you can also specify the managed service account here, for example, and then you can say select user, and you can give manage service account, whatever you have in the domain, and you don't have to give the password. So that is for CES and CEP. I forgot to mention it there. So now going next, application pool identity. So again, NDES needs to talk to interact with a CA to get the certificate. So that is what we selected there. I'm leaving all this blank. The defaults are fine. These are the cryptographic service providers that NDES uses for its RA certificates, and then click install. So after the NDES is installed, what I'm going to, we don't have a Cisco router here, otherwise we could have plugged it in there and we could have shown a real end-to-end scenario. But the router is nothing but another client. So you should be able to see the password. The routers have their own, machines have their own way of doing the things. The protocol they use is the same, but Cisco router needs the password in one way. A casino machine needs a password in another way. So what I will demonstrate here is how do you generate the passwords and then hand it over to the device. It is installed now, and now the administrator wants to configure a device. Admin wants to configure a device to request its own certificate. That means first he needs to generate a password. So this is where the NDES administrator, that is the entity, one of the entities, goes and requests a password. The machine's name, CES CEP dot. The CES CEP is the machine name, by the way. Although we have installed NDES here, it could as well be some server. So it has nothing to do with NDES versus CES CEP. It's just a machine name. console.dom.ntest.com, I think. Search server, MSCP admin. So this is the URL where they can request their certs. And now it will ask for a password. So the enterprise administrator goes here. NDES administrator gives a password. You can never type these passwords right. There. So the enrollment challenge is 8 Unicode characters, and it keeps changing. It expires in 60 minutes. That means you have almost 60 minutes to really run to the device, configure the device, and set it in. So obviously we made it configurable. You can make it 2 hours, 1 hour, 5 minutes, whatever you want. And then, so you can, again, keep clicking on this, refresh, it keeps refreshing. So that presents a problem. Now, if you have, there's lots of hundreds of these machines, and if you have to generate a password for each of these machines and feed them, come back, do this, it is obviously not scalable. So that is where we have introduced the single password mode itself for the network device enrollment service. The server manager, the installations from server manager does not support it yet. So that is something we can improve upon. So to change this to single password mode, currently, this is the way. You go to local machines, software, Microsoft, cryptography, then MSCP. MSCP is we have updated the name, but not the registry key itself. The MSCP is Microsoft Certificate Enrollment Policy. It is the Microsoft's implementation of CEP. So you go to you use single password, you just turn it to true. That is one thing you have to do. And there's another thing that you have to do, which is, this is especially necessary when you run network service, when you run NDES as a domain account or a service account. So these are the application pools. What's an application pool? The CES has an application pool, CEP has an application pool, NDES has an application pool. Application pool is what the name itself says. There can be multiple applications in that pool. It's just a way of, abstract way of looking at the things. So you click Advanced Settings, and here you need to change this to true, load user profile. So these are the two settings that you have to remember. These are documented in the white paper, by the way. And why did we do that? The reason is, remember, in single password mode, the NDES service cannot keep generating passwords on the fly. It has to generate one password, keep it somewhere safe, and it has to fetch the same password and keep giving the same thing again and again to the admin. So somewhere safe, that's the term there. So how does it keep it somewhere safe? That means it needs to encrypt it, and when it needs to have access. How does it encrypt it? So we use DPAPI protection to encrypt the keys. And DPAPI, if you are using a domain account or a service account, it needs some place where it can generate the keys and play with the keys a little bit here and there. It needs a scratch pad kind of area. And that is the user profile that it stores it. That is why I needed to turn that to true. Too much into the dev details there, but nothing wrong in learning the things. So now that we have configured the NDES service in a single password mode, we have to restart it. So I stop it, start it. That was too fast. So let's wait a couple of seconds, start. Okay, there. And that's all you need to do. And we go here and say refresh, there. So that's the single password mode, and the key thing to look here is that it will not expire. So that has a downside also, as you know. If the password never expires, so you have to think about it. Now there are two things that I want to talk about. One is, so in the single password mode, what happens is that, that thing can be fed to all the devices, and all of the devices, you can automate the solution easily, and they can keep requesting the certificates. So one of the questions you might be asking is, why do we have a different protocol for NDES for the devices, and why do you have a different protocol for CES and CEP? CES is based on WS Trust, built on SOAP and WSHTTP and all that. Whereas NDES is based on CEP, Simple Certificate Enrollment Protocol. Why these two things? Can't we combine these two things? There is a reason why the protocol exists in the first place. The reason is that these mobile devices and other devices don't have enough memory in them. They are very too short. At least the routers that I have seen, the old routers, they can hardly hold 5 certificates. So they don't have much horsepower to run a complicated and complex clients on them. The Windows PK client, on the other hand, is quite complex, and in the sense that it provides lots of features. That is why it is complex. Auto enrollment is there. You have machine enrollment, and other such things are done. So that's one of the reasons. And I cannot demonstrate here the renewal mode, but I'll just briefly recap what it is. So it's like me, when I first came to the United States, I went to the driver's license office to get a driver's license. So they asked for my passport and date of birth certificate and other things. And then they have issued me the driver's license. After that, they never requested again my passports or anything for me to renew it. Because they issued it, before it expires, I should be able to renew that driver's license with itself. And that is what is happening. And that is what happens in the world of devices too. Once the passport here is equivalent to this challenge, my passport here is equal to the password here. That means the device, when it does the first request, it has the password, it requested the certificate, it got the certificate. Then it should be able to reuse that certificate to generate a new request and renew itself. And that is what the renewal feature in the NDES does. Having said that, the second point I want to talk about is that the single password mode feature that came in, it came in as a customer request. That means customer sent an email saying, I have these thousands of these casino machines. How am I going to automate this? That's the question we got. And we listened. We immediately got it in the end of the milestone. We immediately got that feature in. I think the point I'm trying to make here is that if you have any feedback and comments or anything else like that, be sure to send them to our emails, John or Rashmi or I or anybody for that matter. The reason is your feedback will be taken very seriously. And we kind of, that directly goes to the feature teams. I don't know how many of you know how internal things at Microsoft work, but your feedbacks and comments go to the table directly, and there will be heated debates on that, and we do what's finally best for the customer. So try to give in as much as feedback or comments you have. As I said earlier, this single password mode is a direct result of customer feedback. Customer just had to send an email saying, hey, I have these thousands of these customer missions. What am I going to do? We are at the end of the milestone, and we got the feature in. So if you have, and you have this extraordinary privilege here, right? And we don't have that extraordinary privilege here. The privilege to look at these features with beginner's eyes. So you may find some things odd. You may feel, why should I click next here? Why can't I do it that way? Why can't I do it this way? Give voice to those and bring it to us, because you have those beginner's eyes and you will be able to see things clearer than I or we can. So we'll consider those also. So with that, I hand it over back to Rashmi, and we'll probably take John, Rashmi, and I can take any questions you may have. In the last 5 minutes, I think, we have 4 minutes, 51 seconds. Yes. Yes.
Got a question. When it comes to the identity of the certificate, when you're using CEP, is it using what's the identity on the certificate that's actually being issued out at that point? How does it get that information during that time?
Okay. So the question is, because the device has no domain identity, how does the device have, who puts the name of the device, and how do you trust it, for example? That's the question. If you know templates, what templates are, there are different types of templates. One is a view to look at the templates is online templates and offline templates. Online templates are where the subject information and identity is pulled from the AD and put it into the certificate. Alice, the one you have seen certificate, that came from an online template, because Alice account is already there in the AD. The CA was able to pull that information, put it in the certificate, and issue it. The device, there is no AD sitting there. So if the device says, I am device 1, how does the CA really know the device 1? So that is where all this comes into place. These are called, some are called offline templates. Offline templates means the subject information can come from the device itself. The subject information comes from the device itself. And then where is the authentication, right? The authentication part is the one that ties the password. That's the authentication part. So NDES always checks that you would give the password to one device and say, assuming you are the admin and you can be trusted, you probably have given that to one particular device called device 1. And that makes a request with the password. And then NDES looks at the password. It does not care what the subject is. The device could as well have claimed it is device 2. It could have been all right. Because you have given the password, we trust it. It's the same thing as you as a person don't have identity in the AD unless we trust only the username and password. We don't trust you really. We trust username and password. Because you have the username or password, we trust you. That's the way it is. So then the CA just issues the certificate to device 1. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, so I'm trying to just kind of formulate what does it look like specifically on if we have 1,000 iPads.
Yeah.
And we have your chicken and the egg scenario of getting a certificate so they can use it for VPN access, like calls or something like that. So it's just kind of imagining that whole scenario, and with the identity and understanding the identity on that iPad, so that we know when they're hitting the network that it is John Smith, whatever, coming into the network at that time, because that's the whole point of the network authentication.
Yeah. So if you build the chain on the CA certificate itself, you should be able to know. But yeah, you cannot just look at the device 1, the name, and just say that, oh, it is valid.
I was just trying to really formulate
Okay.
you provide that information, and you were saying that each device has its own method of kind of dealing with this. So I'm guessing on the iPad itself, you're typing that in with that password.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I had seen a paper on it. I don't have it on the top of my... Did you see?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm with Juniper, and we actually opened the case with Microsoft, and that's what caused Rob to write the white paper.
Oh, okay.
I was going to ask if there was anything done in, basically what's going on is in R2,
Yeah.
without SP1, I don't know if there were any changes made, but in Apple's implementation of CEP, when they send the request to IIS, the request is much longer than what IIS default security policy will accept.
Is it a 4096 based key?
3072 or so. I actually
3072, okay. So I think we fixed that one.
in SP1 or
SP1, no?
Without SP1, you just run a command.
yeah, there's a command that you run. Right.
And then it allows IS to accept it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I was just wondering if that's. I mean.
We just ran it. We're not on SP1 yet. We ran it on R2.
Okay.
And it's working out for you.
Okay. Any more questions? Yes.
If you have like a hybrid
So the question is, how does the CES CEP, you want renewals to happen via internal to the network?
You want to use password authentication for one, and then two-step authentication
For other. Yeah, and different URIs is also recommended for the load balancing purposes. So you'll anyway have to install those things. And also your IP addresses cannot be exposed directly on the internet, right? So you must have some translator, IP translator that's sitting there somewhere in between and doing the things.
Just
Yeah.
one other quick question. So in your demonstration of CEP and CES, you showed, for lack of a better term, sneaker netting the URL over to the end user so that they could configure the certificate request. Any chance of building some sort of a utility to do that? Once you put that type of configuration responsibility in the end user's hands, you run into trouble.
I see.
Do local policy.
Okay.
Exact same thing.
Yeah.
We could never explain that to an end user.
Yeah.
And you just don't.
No, but you can have a scripted way to have it pushed through group policy if it's within the domain, or a local policy, and put it on the people's.
See, okay.
The biggest challenge is what organizations are doing today in many cases, especially in like the remote access world, is they're allowing consumers to go out and buy devices off the shelf that are never going to be a member of the domain.
Yeah.
So in that case, and requiring certificate-based authentication for remote access, they need to have the ability to do the enrollment and getting a device certificate installed. Otherwise, they're out of luck, right? So
How to do that for non-Windows devices?
No. For Windows devices that are not domain members.
Yeah, so I think the point that Sunil and Rocky were trying to bring up is that the scenario that you're saying where somebody goes to Best Buy or whatever and they buy a PC, they want to be able to connect that to the network. That is very possible with the web services enrollment that we described. But the bootstrapping process for that would be a little bit different than using group policy for it. Instead,
Right,
there'd be
exactly.
a portal. So if there's a web scripting interface for this, for configuring those policies.
Can that be
So
documented somehow or another?
Yeah. So somebody could log, basically, like you'd have a URL that people would go to, like vpn.contoso.com or whatever. They'd authenticate with their normal AD username and password to that. They click a button that says configure me for remote access or something, and it can configure that policy on their machine to do the certificate.
That would be, I mean,
That's
that's,
exactly right.
yeah, if something like that could be documented officially, that would be great.
And Kurt can take a note about following up on some documentation for that.
So we don't have to develop that ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, once you put that, once you put that decision in the end user's hands, I mean, you start generating help desk calls and things just don't go smoothly.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
That's fair.
Any other? Yes.
So how is then the CEP CES better than me just writing a web, customizing a little bit of an RA page that I can have
True.
in 2003, which is
So
a web page.
what I'm referring to is you just would log in one time, click a button, and it would configure a policy on your machine to do automated enrollment for any certificate templates, automated renewal, everything else. It's just a one-time bootstrapping to a non-domain machine.
So if you want to do multiple certs on a non-domain,
Or if you just wanted
non-corporate
them to automatically renew themselves. I mean, the scenario you're talking about would require every time you get a cert, somebody would have to go through and manually click on these buttons to go through it. Whereas with this, it effectively gives you all the capabilities you're expecting with auto enrollment, but now does that without having the machine actually domain join. So it's kind of an additional to that.
So none of you are developers here, but for the developer world, that's also another cool thing. They can write their own clients that can interact with CES and CEP. As a matter of fact, we have done some interoperability testing with GoDaddy and VeriSign and other partners, and they were able to write their own clients which can interact with our stuff, and they can write their own servers and that kind. Yes?
So is the specification for writing your own clients for 7 says public?
They are totally
Yeah.
public.
MSWSTP protocol. So it's on the protocol documentation site.
And can you also use it on the WinPE image to get some NAM certificate?
It's not
WinPE?
included in WinPE.
It's not included.
in WinPE image, but I mean, if you wanted to write a component that would run on it.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, so like I said, it's an open protocol. You should thank everybody for coming on.
Thank you for everybody for coming and taking the time to attend this session.
Thank
and
you.
Have a wonderful day today.
Okay. All right. Good.